Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We're truly delighted to welcome Dr. Allan Lichtman to Business Talk. Professor Allan Lichtman is a distinguished historian, political analyst, and public intellectual whose work bridges rigorous scholarship with real-world impact. He earned his PhD from Harvard University in 1973, specializing in modern American history and quantitative methods, and began his academic career at American University the same year. Over the decades, he rose from assistant professor to distinguished professor, earning recognition as Scholar Teacher of the Year for his excellence in both research and pedagogy. Professor Allan is the author of 13 books and hundreds of scholarly and popular articles, with a body of work that spans American political history, voting rights, and contemporary governance. His acclaimed titles include White Protestant Nation, a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, FDR and the Jews, co-authored with Dr. Richard Breitman, which won the National Jewish Book Award, and The Case for Impeachment, the National Independent Bestseller. His influential Keys to the White House model has successfully forecast nearly every US presidential election since 1984, cementing his reputation as one of the foremost election forecasters in the world. Beyond academia, Dr. Lichtman has served as an expert witness in over 100 civil and voting rights cases and is a frequent commentator across major global media platforms. Recognized among the world's top geopolitical thinkers, he was ranked among 100 most influential experts globally and has received a Lifetime Achievement Honor from Who's Who. Today we have the privilege of dwelling into his ideas, experiences, and insights through his compelling book, Conservative at the Core, A New History of American Conservatism, which offers a fresh perspective on the evolution of conservative thought in the United States. Professor Allan, we are truly delighted to have you on Business Talk. The honor without question is entirely yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Professor, in Conservative at the Core, you argue that many of the conservatism's most familiar principles are more useful as public messaging than as governing commitments. What led you to that conclusion?
Well, I first began to discern the difference between what I saw as what conservatives were actually doing over 100 years or so since the end of World War I and what they were professing for public consumption. And I saw a major gap between the two, which then was further developed. That book was written in 2008. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in general nonfiction. And that was refined in my recent book, Conservative at the Core. And to provide insight into this gap between what conservatism really represents and what they profess to represent, I drew upon one of the world's leading epistemologists, a theoretician of how we gain knowledge, the late great Imre Lakatos. And he pointed out that for any system, be it a scientific system or a political system, there are two components. One is the immutable core, what actually defines the system. And then there is what he calls the outer belt of disposable, discardable ideas designed to protect and preserve the core. And I believe I'm the first one to apply that epistemological insight to a political system. And I saw what conservatism was professing as what they believed, not a core principle, but one of these outer belt, dispensable ideas to protect the core by coming up with notions that appeal to the American people, even though they are not what conservatism actually represents.
Professing trace American conservatism back to the period after World War I, rather than to later figures such as William F. Buckley or Barry Goldwater. Why is that earlier history so important to understanding the movement?
Yes, one of the key insights of my book is that conservatism in its modern form. It's always been conservatism, but modern American conservatism rose out of the end of World War I in response to two very important developments. One was the influx of the so-called new immigrants, that is, immigrants from Southern or Eastern Europe, like my grandparents from Lithuania and Russia. And they were different. They were not white Protestants. They were heavily Catholic and heavily Jewish. And that led to a crisis among those who I call the anti-pluralists, who believed in a white Protestant Nordic America. The second crisis was, of course, the progressive reforms of the Woodrow Wilson era. He was the first progressive Democrat, foreshadowing Franklin Roosevelt. And then we saw, in response to this, the origins of the modern American conservative movement. Have we forgotten that three of our most conservative presidents were elected by landslides right after World War I? Warren Harding in 1920, Calvin Coolidge in 1924, and Herbert Hoover in 1928. Ronald Reagan used to say Calvin Coolidge was his favorite president. Have we forgotten, the legacy of these three conservative presidents who presided also over a conservative Congress? And so much of what was the policies and programs of modern conservatism have their origins in the 1920s. As I said, a reaction against the new immigrants. What did we get? The most restrictive immigration law in the history of the country, the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924, that imposed rigid quotas on European immigration, barred Asian immigration entirely, and those quotas for Europe were heavily biased towards Northern and Western Europe and heavily biased against Eastern and Southern Europe. Countries like Russia, Lithuania, and Italy had minuscule quotas. And of course, we also saw during this period major tax cuts, deregulation. We saw the beginnings of the first war on drugs, the war on pornography. We saw the first major grassroots conservative organization, the Ku Klux Klan, which in its anti-Semitism, anti-Black, pro-Protestant, foreshadows a lot of what we've seen today. So to argue that modern conservatism doesn't have its origins in three of our most conservative presidents, policies that closely mirror subsequent conservative programs, just as the height of folly.
Professor, your book suggests that conservative leaders have repeatedly embraced private enterprise rather than free enterprise. How do you distinguish those two ideas in practice?
Yes, free enterprise is one of those out-of-belt, discardable principles which is contradicted by one of the core principles of American conservatism. The idea that conservatives stand for free enterprise is fundamentally contradicted by what they do. It was Richard Nixon who once said, "Don't listen to what I say, watch what I do." And of course, what is probably the biggest enemy of free enterprise and free markets? Protective tariffs. And again, back in the 1920s, Republicans repealed the low tariffs of the Wilson era, imposed new restrictive tariffs, culminating, of course, in the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff under Herbert Hoover during the Depression. And of course, we see that continuing in both the first and second terms of Donald Trump. Anathema to free enterprise. And add on to that crony capitalism, add on to that special tax breaks for business, add on to that all kinds of subsidies by conservative state governments to bring businesses into their states, and add on to that the uh, anti-union busting campaign to destroy free bargaining between unions and employers. That's why it is ludicrous to believe that Republicans stand for free enterprise. What they really stand for, and what all of these policies represent, is private enterprise, business, irrespective of the notion of free markets and free enterprise. That's why so many historians are so off base when they call modern conservatism neoliberalism, kind of free market, laissez-faire programs. It's just the opposite.
Professor discuss a long line of leaders from Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. What patterns connect them most strongly in your view?
Yes, there is a great line of continuity among conservative leaders. First and foremost, of course, not support for free enterprise, but support for private business. The other key element that unites Republicans, well, not just Republicans, because for a long time there was a lot of conservatism in the Democratic Party, in the Southern Democrats. That didn't change until the late 20th century. So what unites conservatives as their core principles is pro-private enterprise, pro-business, irrespective of free markets. And the other thing that unites them is this very narrow view of what they call traditional Christian values, another outer belt discardable proposition, because they don't even come close to following traditional Christian, or sometimes they call it Christian Judeo values. They emphasize throughout the far fringes of the teachings of Jesus, things like, transgender, homosexuality, abortion, which have almost nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus, who overwhelmingly emphasizes the dangers of greed and wealth, which all of these Republicans totally discard. It was Jesus who said, it is easier for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven. What else does Jesus emphasize? Fidelity to truth, caring for the poor, caring for the sojourner, all of which have largely been discarded throughout this long history of American conservatism.
Professor, many commentators describe Donald Trump as a break from traditional conservatism. Your book argues the opposite. What is the strongest evidence that Trump represents continuity rather than rupture?
Yes, Trump represents the culmination of American conservatism. He has been as faithful as you could to the two core values of conservatism, not this outer belt like phony free enterprise or phony limited government, when they supported prohibition, immigration restriction, major surveillance, ICE invading our communities. Forget that. Donald Trump has been utterly faithful to the two core values of conservatism, which are, as I mentioned, support for private enterprise, not free enterprise. He's imposed tariffs, he's favored certain business, he's invested the government in business, he's deregulated, he's adopted huge tax cuts. That's why business loves him. That's why he gets those donations. That's why the stock market is doing well. Not because the economy is doing well, because everything that he's doing has boosted the profits of business. And of course, he is utterly consistent with the culture war, right? With this emphasis on these fringe cultural teachings of Jesus. He has taken the culture war to its culmination, which you can trace all the way back, right, to immigration restriction, to the Ku Klux Klan, to all of these conservatives back in the 20s talking about immigration poisoning the blood of America. They weren't talking about Muslims and Mexicans then. They were talking about Jews and Catholics. But it's the same point. This xenophobia, this culture war, this support for business, above all, is what conservatism has been all about, and Donald Trump is the culmination. Let me also make another point. It is ludicrous to say that Donald Trump isn't a real conservative when virtually every conservative in America supports him. In the last election, he had support from 90%, almost every self-professed conservative in America. It's a record. He even beat Ronald Reagan, the conservative icon and conservative support. Virtually every conservative elected official or candidate in America has lined up behind Donald Trump. Conservatives in the Senate have supported every one of his very controversial nominees. And commentators are way off base. Maybe there is some element of being afraid of Donald Trump, but that's not the point. The point is they agree with him. He represents, as they do, the culmination of modern conservatism.
Professor, you also examine conservative Democrats associated with Jim Crow in the South. How does including them change the way we should think about the history of conservatism in America?
Yes, this is very important because we tend today to equate conservatism with the Republican Party, and that's largely true today. Conservatives and liberals have largely sorted themselves out between the two parties, but that's a late 20th century development. Prior to that time, there was a tremendous amount of conservatism within the Democratic Party, notably Southern segregationist conservatives like the famous Senator Cotton Ed Smith. And the reason for this, of course, goes all the way back to the Civil War and Reconstruction. Conservatives, segregationists, Southerners were voting against the party of Lincoln, which was the Republican Party in those days. And that kind of largely persisted until the late 20th century when you got this enormous sea change, one of the most important changes in American political history, with Southern conservatives migrating into the Republican Party. This actually moved the Republican Party to the right because you got these very conservative Southerners now becoming Republicans. And it moved the Democratic Party to the left because you got kind of rid of, to a great extent, the conservative Southern wing of the Democratic Party.
Professor, one of the recurring themes in your book is the gap between rhetoric and reality in conservative politics. What is the most striking example of that gap across the past century?
What is the greatest crisis of conservatism? Yes, the greatest crisis for conservatism is exactly what my book is all about. And really, even scholars, much less commentators, don't understand the difference between the outer belt of discardable principles and what conservatives really stand for, which is their very narrow view of Christian teachings and private enterprise. We've already shown, things like limited government, free enterprise are just discardable principles that they violate all the time, that are out there for public consumption. Look at states' rights. They've supported for so many years a right to life amendment that would override the laws of most states. When they supported prohibition, that overrid the laws of, at least 1/3 of the states. You see Republicans in Congress interfering with state prosecutions of Donald Trump. Fiscal responsibility. Who's blown some of the biggest holes in the American deficit? Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and of course, Donald Trump. So none of these so-called principles of conservatism that they constantly profess and even fool very fine scholars. But this is the crisis of American conservatism because they do not stand for any of the things that they claim to stand for. And that creates an enormous gap between what they claim and what is real, which is one of the reasons why Donald Trump is the most prolific liar in the history of the presidency. He has issued more lies and more misleading statements than all prior presidents combined. He is responsible for the two biggest, most protracted, worst lies in American history: that Barack Obama, our first African American president, wasn't legitimate because he was born in Africa, not the US, delegitimizing, which is part of a long history of conservatism in the South and the Ku Klux Klan, delegitimizing Black people in America. And of course, the next biggest lie is that he won 2020 in a landslide, but was deprived of it because of Democratic fraud. And he's not come up with a single example, not one, even in his big speech, on electoral integrity, not one example of any significant fraud that occurred in 2020. His own Justice Department, his own Cybersecurity Department said it was a fair, secure election. So this is the big Republican crisis, the gap between reality and what they profess.
Professor, your prediction system, the keys to the White House, made you widely known beyond academia. Has that long experience studying elections shaped the way you approach the history of conservatism?
Yes, I developed the keys to the White House way back in 1981 in collaboration with one of the world's leading mathematicians, Vladimir Kailas-Borak, the head of the Institute of Pattern Recognition and Earthquake Prediction in Moscow, one of only a handful of scientists worldwide who is a member of both the Soviet and US Academies of Science. And the fundamental insight behind the keys is that it's not campaigning that counts. It's not the ads, the speeches, the debates, the tricks. Rather, it's governance that counts. And the way to solidly predict elections, and I've been doing it for 45 years and I've been wrong once. And of course, everybody pounces on the fact that I've been wrong once, but I think 10-1 is a pretty good record. The whole idea is it's governance that counts, that the American people are pragmatic, that they make a reasonable decision on whether or not the performance of the party holding the White House, whether the sitting president is running or not, merits them 4 more years. I can also give you some insight into why I was wrong in 2024. And by the way, I was the first to admit it. These, phonies who claim, oh, we exposed Lichtman being wrong. I admitted it on election night. And I believe I was the first election analyst to call Donald Trump's win. So why do I think I was wrong? First of all, I've been saying for a long time, and people don't listen because all they care about is, are you right or wrong, that my system is based on history. It's very robust. Retrospectively, it goes all the way back to 1860, prospectively back to the early 80s. But historical patterns can change. And, a 45-year run is a pretty good run. And what changed, and I think undermined my system in 2024, was the massive amount of disinformation. There's always been disinformation, but we've never seen the degree of disinformation we saw in 2024, headed, of course, by the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, whose misinformation, according to reports, was viewed billions of times. Let me give you one illustration of how misinformation decided this election: the abortion issue. Everybody thought this would be a huge issue for Democrats after the Supreme Court overturned Roe. And indeed, when you looked at the exit polls, the gap between the pro-choice and the pro-life position was more than 30 percentage points, not 30%, 30 percentage points. That indeed should have propelled Harris to an easy victory. But because of all the disinformation that was put out on the abortion issue, when you looked at who do you think would handle abortion better, Harris or Trump, you didn't get a 30-point gap, which would have led to a Harris landslide. You didn't get a 15-point gap. You didn't get a 10-point gap. You didn't get a 5-point gap. You got a 3-point gap, less than 1/10 of the gap between pro-choice and pro-life. So I do think something fundamentally changed, which is why I was wrong. And I admitted it in 2024. And I'm now rethinking in light of, a system that's now 45 years old, does it need to be modified or changed for the next election?
Professor Allen, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. At the heart of the book, what do you believe is the central crisis in conservative thought today? And what does this crisis reveal about the movements in the future?
Yes, my book, Conservative at the Core, highlights the fundamental crisis of American conservatism in a way that no other book does, which is why conservatives hate it. They've blasted it, they've gone after it, and you've touched a nerve when that happens. I also have a new book coming out in September, Great American Presidents, which shows that Donald Trump is the worst of American modern presidents. The book, Great American Presidents, now available for pre-order, published September 22nd, also has, and you can evaluate presidents for yourself, a 10-point Lichtman keys to presidential greatness. So I think Conservative at the Core exposes what conservatism isn't about, which is these very popular things they claim to be, and what I believe is a very, very unpopular, very corrupt core at the heart of American conservatism. And as I said, conservatives have been brilliant at promoting themselves, far better than liberals who have been absolutely deficient on messaging.
Professor Allen, it has been a true privilege to explore these ideas with you and to learn from your deep historical perspective and scholarship. Your work in Conservative at the Core offers not only a powerful reinterpretation of American conservatism, but also an important lens through which to understand the political current shaping the United States today. Thank you for sharing your time.
Can I add one thing?
Sure, please.
You want to catch my continuing analysis? I have a live show every Tuesday and Thursday, 9 p.m. DC time, 9 p.m. U.S. Eastern time. You can catch it at Allan Lichtman YouTube, at Allan Lichtman YouTube. And the insights of the book are informing what I do every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern. We have 180,000 subscribers. We've passed 250,000 shows. 250 shows, not 250,000.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your insights, and reflection with us. We are grateful for this conversation and the opportunity to engage with such a compelling body of work. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Be sure to send me a link.